about how psychology, a social science, and abstract art intersect. People generally put the arts and sciences in separate boxes, but I like to argue that the two subjects are intertwined, for sight alone is a neurological process. To ignore the neurological part of abstract art is missing a major key component. Things such as abstract art challenges our typical neurological process of sight, which also will then affect our psychology. Abstract art forces our brains to work even harder than representational work because it's too easy for our brains to recognize what we're looking at, because the process of sight uses not only our visual cortex but your prefrontal. The prefrontal cortex, it's the part of the brain that is cerebral, affects our personality, decision making, all that fun stuff. But in abstract art, we are challenged with the unknown. We have to depend more on our visual cortex alone. Because abstract art typically looks like something we never encountered before in the natural world, therefore, we are psychologically distant from the work. The abstractness is part of the mystery, which leads to curiosity, and we spend more time with the work. We psychologically and then physically change our relationship to the art. Painting and sculpture's goal for centuries was to be illusionistic and portray the natural world. But then with the invention of photography, art had to find a new way to do something that photography couldn't. Thus, the emergence of abstraction. The three South American artists and their work are good examples of how abstract art reframes the way we think. The South American artist we're going to be looking at is actually a German-born artist named Gego. Gego got her degree in architecture and engineering at Stuttgart, but then she moved in 1939 to Caracas to escape the rising anti-Semitism in Germany. Gego was an architect and industrial designer in her early career, but then in the 1950s, she started to become a fine artist and making prints and drawings. Her work was abstract, but it was probably due to just how popular geometric abstraction kinetic art was in Caracas. I'm not sure which box I would put Gego in, geometric abstraction or kinetic art. I would either have to put her in both or put her in neither. She is geometric and kinetic. A lot of Gego's signature work focused on line, and the work I would like to highlight is when Gego uses the three-dimensional line. Line is a means to express the relation between points, and when seen in a three-dimensional space, Gego's drawings are brought into the viewer's personal space. Reticularia is an installation of wires that goes up the wall and onto the ceiling, creating a web, and it hangs. It was made using found materials, mostly steel wires. And this installation is so interesting because sculptures traditionally were very static and heavy because they sort of confront the gravity of the object and their solidness. But in Gego's work, her sculpture becomes weightless. In all abstract art, we are psychologically distanced, and the viewers are trying to figure out where they stand in relation to it, or just how do we behave around the work. Gego has us looking all over our surroundings and even up. In Reticularia, the installation submerges the viewer into her work of delicate line. We become aware of where we stand in relation to the work because the work itself frames its own space. It's like it has its own agency in the room.
Jesús Soto was a Venezuelan op and kinetic artist, sculptor, and painter. His abstraction did not suppose an artistic objectivity or an absolute subjectivity, but the prospect of closing the distance between artwork and spectator. He saw the art-society relationship as similar to that of science-society, where art functions as a tool of knowledge, and where artistic procedures were analogous to those of science. Optical art describes works that use meticulous optical illusions to engage with the core of our visual sensory apparatus. Kinetic art describes works of art with incorporated movement, whether literally or as an illusion. These movements kicked off in the middle of the 50s and peaked during the 1960s, when they reached international popularity. The artists were preoccupied with science, the psychology of perception, and new technology, and turned their backs on old-fashioned storytelling and romantic sensitivity. Soto's works allow the elaboration of a profound connection between abstraction, movement, and everyday life. The visual unity of objects is destabilized in painting, delving into questions about the phenomenon of perception from aesthetics, in a type of experimentation that Soto saw as comparable to that of physics. Lydia Clark was one of the most popular, influential, and important Brazilian artists, best known for her painting and installation work during the rise of the constructivist and tropicalia movements of the mid 20th century. Clark's work in the context of human psychology aimed to center the human body as part of an art experiment. And from 1976 to 1984, the objects she used in her works shifted from being sensory objects to being relational objects to the body. This was part of a therapeutic treatment aimed at structuring the self. At her residence in Rio, she saw clients thrice a week, offering treatments of various lengths and time. Her subjects were placed in a state of regression, back to a primal stage, while Clark used her relational objects to work with them within the body's fantasy dimension. Her work was now on the outskirts of art, as the objects she had created, which previously could be placed in galleries, had no purpose, cosmetic or monetary, besides existing solely for therapeutic purposes in this context of treatment. Some of the relational objects her clients engaged with were styrofoam ball mattresses on which people lay down, stones that were placed on different parts of the body, and various fabrics ranging from veils to blankets. She also utilized stockings filled with balls, stones, shells, and plastic bags filled with air, water, or sand. No matter the nature of the material, the object served the purpose of moving the client's body. These objects would often be destroyed or perishable throughout the process. All throughout this process of therapy, a stone held in the palm of the client's hand anchored them to reality. Clark claimed her methods were truly effective and relied and worked specifically on body memory. Body memory in this context can be defined as bodily experiences which the verbal cannot detect. The same idea of the body's unconscious memory has been a frequent subject of research between psychoanalysis and the neurosciences, which only managed to pinpoint its existence in the late 1990s. Today, through further developments in the same fields, we have identified this body memory as implicit memory, something that only forms in humanity after the age of 2. Now, implicit memory, often referred to as non declarative memory, is a type of memory that does not require the conscious or explicit recollection of past events or information, and the individual is unaware that remembering has occurred. Some mundane examples of this could be including typing on a keyboard or riding a bike. Implicit memory is located in the amygdala, the emotion organ, and allows for the return of the non repressed by other parts than memory, parts that Clark widely explored in her psychological work. Implicit memory is written in the body, and some see it as including tastes, habits, ways of behaving, and casts of the human mind. All of this points towards a cognitive unconscious, in which implicit memory plays a central part and which could parallel the unconscious described by psychoanalysis. Clark's borderline practice, on the edges of psychoanalysis, has not been well recognized, despite the therapeutic success confirmed by Clark herself and the people she trained. Clark's art, like her therapeutic practice, is at the edges of art, psychoanalysis, and the cognitive sciences, and definitely ahead of its time.
Abstract art is a challenge. It challenges what we think we know, just like how science does. There's something in how these South American artists make the viewer extra aware of where they stand in relationship to the art. In abstract art, it's easy to think of the work if it's in its own world. But when you put the work of these 3 South American artists into context, I think that there's a parallel in the sense of awareness of place with the artwork, the same way that people feel living in the Americas. Gego, Clark, and Soto were all formally trained artists. Whether they were educated in Europe or in Latin America, they definitely had a Eurocentric agenda at these institutions. These artists are deeply aware of what's going on in Europe, so they're trying to figure out, what does it mean to be a South American artist? Where do they stand? The psychological distance in abstraction makes us aware of place. which is what I would say probably what these artists were trying to do, because that's how they felt in their own work.